So this is part 3 of our ITIL series. Through this series and through the review of the various phases of the ITIL framework, we really have a particular goal in mind, and it's to help organizations grow within their companies, within their organizations. So for the individuals, we want them to see IT as not just an isolated silo, but really we want to encourage the growth of IT, encourage the maturity of IT, and encourage the maturity of the processes that we employ. At the very basic level, IT is responsible for designing the organization's infrastructure, for fixing what's broken. Beyond that, though, we want to, and really we need to, because of Sarbanes-Oxley and other auditing requirements, we've got to be sure that we're carefully managing sensitive financial and legal data, sometimes sensitive security data, if you're a government organization. Going beyond that, then, to really start moving away from being a cost center into saving money for the organization, we've got to learn how to effectively negotiate with our suppliers. And when we are keeping track of the metrics and the KPIs that are relevant to our IT processes, it really helps us to go back to our vendors, to our suppliers, and show where improvement perhaps might be needed, and also to show where perhaps agreements haven't been met, promises that were made haven't been kept, and it really helps to improve the bottom line for the organization and improve the quality of service overall. Finally, the last step here in this value model is to show the business that IT is prepared and able and competent enough to sit at the table when big decisions are being made. Nobody likes having the business go out and make IT decisions without the input of the IT organization, because invariably whatever the business chooses is going to have to be supported anyway. IT really does want to and should and needs to get out in front of some of these decisions, and we do that by showing that we're not just a technician, but that we have a business focus and really integration into the whole business, and we understand what the business needs are. The way that ITIL can help us, there's a number of different ways, and this is evolving. ITIL originally was developed as a kind of a siloed function-based practice. It was developed in the mid-1980s in the UK and started there, expanded throughout Europe, and it was really in version 2 of ITIL that you started to see it more in the United States. They released a more process-based practice. It included many of the same processes that were covered in version 1. In version 2, they expanded on that and built on that and consolidated it into 2 separate documents or books, the service support and service delivery books. Much easier to manage than the previous version 1. They did then revise this in 2007 with the release of version 3. There have been since updates to version 3, so most recently there was an update in 2011. It's now a service lifecycle based practice. It incorporates the teachings of versions 1 and 2, but it does build on it. And really it continues to evolve. So even at RightStar, we've done sessions on how do you combine Agile and ITIL, because there are some perhaps seemingly conflicting guidance there from those 2 frameworks, but ITIL does have the ability to evolve because it is a framework. It's not a set of stone set of rules. It's designed to provide guidance to organizations for these 5 core components of the life cycle. So in our first session, we looked at strategy and design. Strategy is the axis of the life cycle. We moved from there to service design. Our last session was service transition. Today we will cover service operation, and our next session will be on continual service improvement in 2 weeks. I mentioned that we did a session on Agile and ITIL. There are a lot of sources out there for information. It's generally referred to as the ITIL complementary guidance that surrounds the 5 core lifecycle books. So you can learn more about things like ITIL for small organizations, how to develop a service catalog, and many other titles. And we'll talk about that and some of the other sources for information at the end of this presentation. So before we dive into service operation today, I did want to talk a little bit about some of the basic concepts as well as some of the initial phases of the service life cycle that we've covered up till this point. So first, some of the basic concepts. I think one of the important concepts to understand, and this is particularly of note in service operation, is when we talk about roles. In service operations, we talk about functions, which are different from roles, and I'll talk about what those differences are. But first, to understand, roles don't necessarily equal job descriptions. So when we talk about roles in ITIL, there may be the role of a service desk manager. So the service desk manager may also be the incident manager when we're talking about service operation. So the service desk manager may be responsible for the resolution and fix of issues within the organization or incidents within the organization. That doesn't mean the service desk manager does all of that hands-on. They may be ultimately accountable, but of course the service desk team or function would be responsible for the day-to-day activities. To show a little bit about how these teams interact with each other, I mentioned the word accountability. So a service desk or customer support manager may be ultimately accountable for providing support for software, for example, but it's actually the IT team who is responsible for the day-to-day activities. And we may identify other people or groups who need to be consulted and informed about the support we're providing or about any of the other services or activities that we're performing. This constitutes what we call the RACI Matrix. And again, as we've laid it out here, it's very helpful for us to see, for example, if we are updating the customer database, for example. It may be the responsibility ultimately of the IT service manager, but the security manager should be consulted. There's nothing worse than, for example, on the service desk, if you start getting calls about a particular issue and you weren't prepared for it because somebody from the network team, for example, didn't or forgot to let the service desk know that there was going to be a major change to the network that would impact the end users. So it's important in the RACI Matrix to identify paths of communication, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be informed for various activities. To get into the actual service life cycle, we start with service strategy. And I think the important thing to note here is that for each of the phases, there is an output. So from service strategy, we're putting into this our the various processes. So our considerations for service portfolio management, for financial management, demand management. These last two, strategy and business relationship management, they're highlighted because those were new processes that were outlined in ITIL v3 2011. As we go through these processes and employ these processes within our IT organizations, the output from this life cycle, or this stage of the life cycle, is a set of service requirements. The service requirements in turn get handed off to the service design phase. Here we are making sure that the services we're designing meet the needs of the business, and I'm emphasizing that part of this description because what you see throughout the ITIL framework is how IT can work better to meet the needs of the business. So these processes that we list here, and I've already talked a little bit about continuity management when we were talking about the Delta airline issues this week. Everything should be designed, so the appropriate availability should be designed, for example, to meet the needs of the business. So if we're a Monday through Friday 8 to 5 shop, then availability should be provided at the highest levels during that set schedule. Outside of that schedule, we're not as concerned about the availability of the IT services. Realistically, in the world we're living in currently, most shops are expected to provide some level of support 24/7, which is a bigger challenge for IT organizations, of course. We have to manage all of these requirements and all of these processes, so we want to ensure that we're providing appropriate levels of availability, capacity, security. We want to be sure that we have a good plan in place for continuity. We make commitments based on our service levels, and all of this is tied together and should be outlined in our service catalog. The output then of our service design phase of the life cycle is our service design package, which gets handed off to the service transition phase of the life cycle. Here we're focused on moving services from the design into the actual live environment. So we are managing changes. So as the word transition might imply, this does focus heavily on change management. We also want to be sure that we are appropriately tracking and managing our configuration items or assets. We want to be providing appropriate levels of testing and training through release and deployment management. And we want to capture the lessons learned, whether it be known errors or other instructions. We need to start capturing that in our knowledge management system as well. The output from service transition is our release package. And that gets released, as I mentioned, into the live environment, which is where we start talking about service operation. So in service operation, we're focused on the day-to-day activities of managing our services. There are a number of processes that we employ to manage those services, and I'll review each of those. And the work here is being done by a number of different functional areas. Now, logically, these functional areas that make up the IT organization are involved throughout the service lifecycle. But as is the norm in the ITIL lifecycle or the ITIL framework, we usually cover the process or function in the area in which it's most active or most relevant. So that's why we cover functions in the service operation phase of the life cycle. Just checking to see if there were any questions so far before I go on. Now, when I'm training the ITIL Foundation classes, there are some key things that I want people to take away from the class. Obviously, you can't learn everything there is to know about ITIL in a 2.5-day class. However, some of the key takeaways are, first of all, tech terminology. So one of the things I seek to educate people about is what are some of the terms that we use. It's especially relevant here when I seek to educate people as to what the differences are between events, incidents, problems, and requests, because sometimes you hear those terms used interchangeably, but really in ITIL terms, they are each very different. The second thing that I want to teach people about ITIL is the importance of communication. So if you remember the RACI Matrix that I focused on earlier when I was talking about some of the basic concepts in the ITIL framework, we want to be sure we understand what the different activities are in service operation and what the flow of information is or should be. Typically, if we're talking about something like incident management, you have an end user or customer who is presenting a request or issue to the service desk. That gets handed off to a technician who hands it off in turn to someone on the Tier 2 or Tier 3 team who may need to escalate that to an external vendor, who may need to order some new equipment that comes to the warehouse, and then the warehouse needs to communicate that back to the service desk, and it goes around and around from there. So in service operation, what we're seeking to do is really improve the communication between and among the teams. One of the structures that we talk about in service operation and really throughout the service life cycle is a Service Knowledge Management System, or SKMS. This is not just a knowledge base, but really incorporates the entire IT service management set of knowledge and processes. So for most of us, this Service Knowledge Management System is something like BMC's remedy application, remedy force, footprints, those types of systems that can keep track of the various types of requests, change management requests, can keep track of, very importantly, our CMDB, so all of our, the CIs and their relationships to each other and to our end users and to the requests that are coming in. So at the core of this communication usually will be your Service Knowledge Management System. That can be used by primarily the service desk, but it should be extended out to the other functional areas as well. Your service desk is your single point of contact. So for most of the organization, when they think about IT, they're thinking about the people with whom they interact on the service desk. We want to continually improve the quality of the service that the service desk or help desk is providing, and make sure that the service desk understands that their role is to restore service as quickly as possible. They should be advocating for the interests of the customer. So as discouraging as it might be to deal with the issues that are continually presented day after day, with appropriate reporting and appropriate advocacy, they really have the ability, since they're so close to the issues that are occurring within the infrastructure, they really are the ones who have the information to provide to the Tier 2, Tier 3 groups, to management, to identify areas that may need improvement. And finally here, the service desk, because this is an entry-level, typically, position, it allows for the more skilled and therefore more expensive resources to focus on more proactive delivery activities instead of the simpler break-fix types of issues. Some of the other functional areas, there are 4 total that are defined within ITIL. So in addition to service desk, we have technical, applications, and operations management. Technical management focuses primarily on hardware. Applications management focuses primarily on software. And operations management really looks at, there's 2 different components here. We have our operations control. So when we talked about the failures at Delta Airlines, it was somebody hopefully in their operations control group who identified first that there was an issue with their systems. IT facilities management relates to people who are involved in the actual installation and maintenance of the wiring and so on, data centers, equipment and buildings that house our IT equipment. So they're responsible for maintaining and monitoring that. There is significant overlap between these functions. So, of course, technical management would overlap with operations management. Operations management would overlap also with applications management. So if we're monitoring a database, for example, there may need to be some interaction with the database administrators who may be on the applications management side. In addition to this functional overlap between and among these teams, there's often a dual role that each of the teams or each of the IT team members have to play. The dual role is that they are reacting to what's going on in the environment. They need to provide support. But as we mentioned, we try to push as much of that support down as possible because we really want to focus more at this level on more proactive service delivery. So how are we providing new and changed services to the organization? How are we continually improving the service that we're providing or the services that we're providing? So these are the 4 functions that we define within the ITIL framework. At this point, I'm going to move on to the actual processes that we undertake as part of the service operations phase of the life cycle. So at its, I would say, the core of service operations and really the starting point for most organizations when they are working to implement ideas from the ITIL framework is incident management. This is IT at its most basic. It's break fix. How do we restore normal service as quickly as possible? One thing we want to be careful of, though, when we're talking about incident management is not to confuse the incident management module in your IT service management software with the actual incident management process. The incident management module may handle and should handle the incidents, but it may also handle service requests, access requests, and events and alerts. So I'll talk a little bit about what is different or how to differentiate incidents from these other types of records and other parts of these other processes. The reason why it's important to identify the different types of records, so to differentiate an incident from a service request, is because the lead times are going to be much different. So I'm going to kind of click ahead a little bit past prioritization for a moment and just talk about the difference between incidents and service requests. So when you're tracking incidents and service requests, it's important to understand the differences between them. So incidents are unplanned disruptions. So you're trying to print, all of a sudden you can't print. You've got, not sure what it is, but the printer's returning an error. A service request might be something along the lines of, well, going down the hall is too far, or hopefully more valid reason like I'm working HR and I need to have a printer on my desk because I'm printing sensitive information. So the service request might be something that's planned. So I'm requesting a new or changed service. With a service request, the currently provided service is not disrupted. You're just asking something for something new or different. Risks and costs are known and accepted with service requests. We know how much it's going to cost if you request a particular desktop printer, as opposed to incidents where the risks and costs related to the resolution can be volatile. The resolution for a service request is the request fulfillment process. And an incident can lead to a service request, but not vice versa. So, and somebody may call because they're having an issue with their laptop, and it's ultimately determined that they need a new laptop. So that then gets handed off to the service request or request fulfillment process. But a service request doesn't revert back to an incident or doesn't use the incident management process as part of the fulfillment. So to go back to the prioritization, the reason it's important to understand the differences between incidents and service requests and some of the other types of records that we handle is because when you are prioritizing requests that come in, and if these priorities are connected to service levels, it doesn't make sense to track incidents and service requests together. With an incident, you're trying to resolve this issue as quickly as possible. With the service request, you may have to wait for vendors to ship equipment. There may just be a standard expectation of how long it takes to fulfill a particular service request, and you do want to have the service request be fulfilled within a reasonable time frame, but it's not going to be the same type of time frame that you would have for an incident. With prioritization, we want to understand first the urgency. So how critical is this particular service to the business? So email, for example, is very critical to most businesses. If you're a hospital and you're dealing with a patient records system, that's going to be very critical to make sure that the doctors and nurses and anybody who's patient-facing has that information when they need it. Same hospital, if you're working with an accounting system, it's important, but it may not be as life and death critical to the business as your patient records. When you add that critical nature of the service, so the urgency should be related to the service that is being provided. When you combine that with the impact or the number of people affected, so if you have a hospital-wide outage of your patient record system, then that is likely going to be a high level of criticality, a high number of people impacted. It would then have a corresponding high level of priority. So you can develop a matrix of priority levels based on impact versus urgency. So high level urgency and low level impact may have a middle level priority. And again, this is most relevant when you're talking about incidents, because with incident management, again, we're seeking to resolve the issues as quickly as possible. Already talked about service requests. Also wanted to cover incidents and problems and how they're different. Problems, first of all, to define a problem. A problem is the underlying cause of one or more incidents within the organization. A problem, or the way we handle a problem, may be proactive. So if we have known errors, for example, we may be able to get out in front of some of the problems that are reported to the organization. Many times, however, problem management deals with in a reactive manner, where we're looking at trends. We want to try to minimize the impact of the incidents that couldn't be prevented. Developing workarounds is an important part of problem management, as is pursuing root cause analysis. So to look at how problems are different from incidents, the example I usually give is if somebody were to call with a printer issue, can't print to the printer down the hall. Now, the problem manager should have as his or her responsibility to determine what the root cause is of that printer outage. Is it a paper jam? Do we need to order more toner? Does this printer need to be sent back for warranty repair? But while that problem manager is doing all of this root cause analysis, the incident manager or the person on the service desk should be looking at how to restore this service as quickly as possible. And usually that means something along the lines of rerouting that end user to an alternate printer. Printing capability is restored. The incident then can be closed, even if that person is printing to a printer down the hall. It would be the problem manager's responsibility then to circle back once the problem is identified and resolved, to go back and inform anybody who's been impacted by that problem and let them know that they can be rerouted now to back to their original printer if desired. The next comparison I want to make is comparing incidents to events. And in some organizations, this is a little bit more difficult to explain, because when they think of an incident, especially if it's manufacturing, that's what we in IT might call an event. So you have an incident on the assembly line. Well, it's only an incident if it's something that is broken and needs to be fixed. You know, there might be something that happens that doesn't necessarily mean you need to repair the equipment, for example. But in IT, there is an overlap between incidents and events. Some events might be just informational. So if you are looking at, a good example is Microsoft Windows event log. There are lots of events that are recorded there. Some of them are informational, like John Doe logged on to the server last night at 10 p.m. Isn't really critical. It's important, especially if we then 5 minutes later get a warning that there's a breach of a particular database or something else going wrong. Then it might be important related to other information. Another type of a warning might be something along the lines of, your mailbox only has a certain amount of capacity remaining. Again, may not warrant the creation of an incident unless it would have to depend on the threshold and at what time it's occurring. But again, that might need to be a decision made by human intervention. Exceptions, though, almost always trigger an alert and an incident. So an exception would be if you've now crossed the threshold of and exceeded the mailbox's capacity, and you're no longer able to receive email. So that's an explanation of the differences between incidents and events. And alerts are something else entirely. An alert is actually the notification that you receive that an event has occurred. The last process I'll just touch on briefly in service operation is access management. So it goes along with service request management. Access management is a request for access to a new or different system or service, and can be managed by the service desk or by another designated authority. And access requests can be fulfilled by the request fulfillment process. So I mentioned from the previous phases of the life cycle what the output is from each phase. The output from the service operations phase of the life cycle is reports. So day-to-day activities, managing the steady state, we want to have accurate and timely reporting that we can then hand off to continual service improvement. And at our next session, we'll talk in more depth about the continual service improvement Deming Cycle, or the CSI, and the CSI model, and how the check part of this, or the reporting part of this, allows us then to consider what our next actions or corrective actions need to be, and then the cycle continues. Plan, do, check, act. Also in CSI, I mentioned that the output of service operation is reports, or operational level reports. And it's important for continual service improvement because we want to know and understand our key performance indicators. Our key performance indicators are the metrics that help us to manage our processes and services or activities, and they should be based on our critical success factors. So, for example, if we want to maintain our IT services when making a change, then our KPI would be, what is the percentage of reduction of changes that cause incidents? That might be an example of one. So what I want to show you on the next few slides are some examples of KPIs, or key performance indicators, related to service operations. Probably one of the most measured, or I would argue even easy to measure, components of IT is the service desk and incident management. There's a lot of record keeping that goes on related to incident management. So we might have automated call systems. So we might have ACD reports that show us how quickly we're answering the phones. Business value here is measured in minutes. So if our critical success factor is to handle increasing call volume, then what we would want to see as an indicator would be things like a reduction in the mean time to restore service, an increase in incidents resolved or closed within service targets. What we don't want to see are incidents bypassing the service desk. Remember, when an incident bypasses the service desk, that usually means that it's going to a more expensive resource at the Tier 2 or Tier 3 level, which costs the organization money in the long run. We want to see customer satisfaction ratings go up, costs go down, turnover go down, and we want to see the number of incidents escalated go down. I would argue with incidents escalation that may be more of a factor of good knowledge management, which we actually covered in service transition. But all of these things together can indicate improvement in our service desk and in our incident management process. Notice that with each of these KPIs, I indicate a direction. So to give you an example, there may be times when we would want to see the number of incidents go up. So for example, if we're having trouble with incidents bypassing the service desk, an increase in the number of incidents might indicate that more people are contacting the service desk. More people have faith in the service desk, and they're not going around to their favorite technician to bypass the service desk. If we've just had a big training initiative and we are trying to better train our end users as to how to use the technology that they need for their jobs, then we may want to see a decrease in the call volume. It just depends on what your critical success factor is. How you define this determines what kind of KPIs you'll want to see and be measuring for. Some more examples of KPIs are for problem management here. And if we are trying to build our known error database, for example, and improve the amount of workaround information that's available to our service desk, then some of the KPIs might be we want to see a reduction in the number of problem records. We want to see an increase in the number of known errors that are added to our knowledge management database. And we want to see a reduction in the number of incidents that are caused by or linked to problem records. So you should have an IT service management system that allows you to make those relationships between the records so that you can have more effective record keeping and more effective correlation when you're working on issues within the environment. This covers the information that I was hoping to share with you all today. Again, if you use the Q&A, we do have time, a few minutes available to cover some of those questions. But for now, I will just recap what we've discussed, or what I've discussed and reviewed with you all. The latest version of ITIL, V3 and V3 2011, is a service lifecycle-based practice. These are all interactive phases of the life cycle, meaning that the service strategy then relates to or hands off output to service design, which hands off to service transition, in turn to service operation. And surrounding all of it is this idea that we want to continually improve the services that we're providing to the organization. And it's not a static life cycle, meaning that when you identify the needs for improvement, it can go back to strategy and then design and transition and so on. Also, part of ITIL V3 is complementary guidance. So there are a number of books, websites, even sessions like this that enhance the learning and understanding of the ITIL framework. If you have any questions or want to do more reading on this topic, there are a lot of other resources out there. In addition to the books themselves, there are sites that we have available for thought leadership, including resources on RightStar's own website, on our partner BMC's website, and from a few organizations with whom we have partnered in the past, the IT Service Management Forum, USA.org, and Think HDI, which is the Help Desk Institute. If there's no questions, then I thank you all for your time today. Hopefully you will be able to join us on August 24th, same time, for our next session for continual service improvement. And again, if you've either missed parts of today's session or want to review previous sessions, you can see them on our website under our webinars list, or you can go to YouTube and search for RightStar TV.